Uh, Good afternoon and welcome to the latest lecture of the World War II Discussion Forums Fall Series. I'm Greg McNiff, the founder and executive director of the group. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, I want to briefly cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker, or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless of the method, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking your question. We'll take about 20 to 30 minutes of Q&A and go to about 2 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated. Please note there's a donate tab on the website. Third, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have a social media channel on YouTube. Please see the icon at the top of the website to access it, and this talk will be posted to that channel shortly after we finish the talk. Fourth and finally, you can send any feedback to the website at wwiidf.org. Now to this afternoon's speaker. Born and raised in Montana, Lawrence Drake has lived all over the U.S. He has worked as a flight instructor, crop duster, aerobatic instructor, owning and flying a variety of airplanes, including antiques and amateur built. He became an entrepreneur in manufacturing and established a national trade association. Fascinated by his father's World War II experience from a young age, Lawrence has collected an extensive library on the CBI theater, including firsthand accounts and audio histories. Two of his father's original nose art paintings are in the commemorative Air Force collection, and a reproduction is in the National Museum of World War II Aviation. Lawrence is the author of a number of books, including Shellville, Red Boots Rebel, and When Silence Calls. He has also written articles in dozens of national periodicals. This afternoon, he's going to speak on his latest book, Pilots and Painted Ladies, which tells the fascinating story of the 493rd Bomb Squadron in the CBI theater of World War II through the eyes of his father, Lieutenant Vernon Drake. And it combines really very dangerous, high stakes combat missions over the Himalayas with candidly the nose art that the crews use to humanize impersonal war. And I think Lawrence is going to show you some of his pictures and talk about that based on extensive conversations with his father and his father's fellow soldiers. So it's really a fascinating story, great book. The reviews have been top notch. The Journal of Air Force Historical Foundation writes, Pilots and Painted Ladies is more than a historical account. It is a tribute to the resilience and ingenuity of citizen soldiers who answered the call to serve. Drake's narrative ensures that the legacy of the 493rd Bomb Squadron and its contributions to the CBI theater are preserved for future generations, shedding light on a lesser known facet of World War II history. And then Gene Pfeffer, the curator of the National Museum of World War II Aviation, concludes it's a great read. The author clearly spent many hours with his father as the recreated dialogue expertly tells the story of one man's experience serving his country during the war. I would just say it's very human, really a very lovely story. I mean, most of the time we're looking at battles and, millions of people fighting or very larger than life personalities, but this really brought it home, this story. So thrilled to have Lawrence here. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Lawrence.
Well, thanks, Greg. That was a pretty nice introduction there. I hope I can live up to it. Anyway, yeah, I wrote this book, Pilots and Painted Ladies, as a tribute to my father. It's not only an account of his experiences in World War II, but also a love story. It was thoughts and dreams of the girls back home that often kept the boys sane in an insane world of war. And my father was no exception. He simply had the artistic talent to express his dreams and his thoughts. And as Greg said, I was born in Billings, Montana in 1947, 2 years after my dad returned from World War II in 1945. And he'd grown up on a dryland farm in the Dusty Hills there south of Billings. And like so many young men, the war sent him halfway around the world to fight the Japanese. And in his case, he went to the CBI, or the China, Burma, India theater, as a B-24 bomber pilot and a C-109 tanker pilot. Um, I'm not a historian or a scholar or any kind of expert on World War II. I'm simply the son of a father who served, and I wanted to preserve his story as best I could. And unfortunately, my father was a historian and he valued the family history. And he left a record for me to follow. And he kept documents, memorabilia, photos, and remnants from his time in the war. And he also made a number of audio recordings late in his life, actually several hours worth of audio recordings. Now, my parents kept a large cedar chest at the foot of their bed, and that chest contained the family heirlooms and much of my dad's World War II history. And I had a love affair with aviation ever since I can remember, and so part of that allure came from those things that I found in the chest. And of course, what makes my father's story somewhat unique from the other thousands of men who were trained and as aviators and sent into the battles are the paintings that hang in the Henry B. Tippie National Aviation Education Center, which is a part of the Commemorative Air Force in Dallas, Texas. And as someone with artistic talent, Dad painted images on the nose of some of the aircraft in the squadron while he was in the CBI. Two of those paintings made it back to the States and are preserved in the museum, along with 32 other paintings. And this is a shot here of the entrance of the museum. Most of the paintings have been moved into an adjacent room due to their rather risque nature at the request of a few parents. Um, it was kind of interesting. Initially, they had all of the paintings in this entranceway, and I talking to the curator, he said there were just not very many, but a few people did complain that when they bring the young folks in to the museum, and it is actually a museum that's uh, its bent is towards the youth and educating. They just felt it was better to move them into another room. But how these paintings were preserved is I think, a very interesting story. Um, there were over 31,000 heavy bombers built by the U.S. in World War II, and 18,000 of them were B-24 Liberators. And it was the most produced heavy bomber in history. Thousands were lost in battle or abandoned, and no one knows exactly how many of those bombers returned to the States after the war, but it's likely in the tens of thousands. The vast majority, of course, were scrapped since they served no further useful purpose. But there was one salvage yard in Walnut Ridge, Arkansas. It was run by the Texas Railroad Equipment Company. And a man named Not Pratt was the manager of the yard, and he kind of took a liking to these paintings on the nose of these aircraft. And so he had his workers remove some of these panels, and they just used axes and saws and whatever was available to cut these things out. So he saved 34 of these panels and he stored them in a shed with the idea of building a fence around his yard at some point. Well, they stayed in storage for years and never made it out of his garage storage there until they were just donated to the commemorative, or it was the Confederate Air Force at the time, and now they since changed their name to the Commemorative Air Force in the 1960s. And I believe it was in the late 1990s that my father discovered through an article in the National Geographic magazine that two of those saved panels had been painted by him in India. Uh, One was this one, Mission Completed, and the other one is Lassie, I'm Home. And that kind of set off a communication between my dad and the Commemorative Air Force, where he provided hours of recorded audio telling his story related to those paintings. In fact, currently they don't have it, but when I first saw the paintings well, they moved the museum. They moved it from a location in Midland, Texas, to Dallas, and they've just recently made that move. So they're still reorganizing the museum, but at the old museum, and they intend to do on this museum too, is that they have recordings. And at the base of my dad's paintings, there what you could put on these headsets, and you could listen to him tell the story of his painting. And as a side note, my uncle Raymond Drake was also a pilot in the CBI, and he knew nothing about these paintings being in this museum. And one time on a trip, he stopped into the museum just by chance, and he sees my dad's paintings. This is after my father passed away, and and picked up those headphones, listening to my father. Just it was just almost more than he could handle. He was in tears from hearing my father's voice tell these stories. But anyway, it's a great museum. They've done a wonderful job of preserving these paintings. Um, I did find another photograph of one of my father's paintings that it appears that it was cut out and saved because it's you can't tell by this picture, but it actually was mounted on a fence, and so very likely it was another one that came back to the States. And this actually is the picture of the painting that's on my book cover of Pilots and Painted Ladies. And interesting about this one is that I was attending a fly-in in Fort Collins, Colorado, where I struck up a conversation with a couple of guys that were sitting under the wing of a B-25, and that aircraft was owned by the National Museum of World War II Aviation in Colorado Springs. And it turned out that one of the men that was sitting there was Bill Klars, and he's president and CEO of the museum. Well, I was wearing my dad's mission hat at the time, and it had X's and slashes on the bill. The X's were his bombing missions, and the slashes were his missions over the Himalayas. And Bill asked about the hat, and I related the story. And it turned out that the museum was very interested in those paintings and had attempted to acquire them from the CAF, but were unable to. And so I just kind of said offhandedly that if they would provide me with the site of a B-24, I'd be happy to reproduce one of my father's paintings for the museum using the same materials and the same technique that he had used. Well, to my surprise, he agreed. And this is the result. So they actually built a section of a B-24. Actually, I got online and downloaded the actual manufacturing plans from the factory for the B-24 and then took this section of those plans. And so the museum actually built this section. If you'd look at the back side of it, you'd see it's built just the way it was built in the factory, and even the number of rivets are correct on it. And then I took my dad's drawing and was able to project it up on the side of the airplane, this section of the airplane, and then was able to reproduce his painting. It's not completely uh, perfect, but I think it's a pretty good representation. On the back side of this particular display is then a display of um, a lot of the memorabilia that I donated to the museum as well, including his flight jacket there that I used to wear when I rode my motorcycle as a kid. But I'm just so honored for them to display all of these things of my father's. Anyway, my father was in his second year of college when Pearl Harbor was bombed in December 7th, 1941. And he and his college friends went to the recruiting office to sign up, but they were turned away because there were crowds of men trying to enlist. So he later enlisted and went through pilot training in Pampa, Texas. And eventually he got a seat as a co-pilot on B-24 bombers. And while he was in training, he, being an artist, applied his skills to the class books. He was on the class book staff, and this is his class book, and this is the class of 44F, which basically means it was the sixth class, graduating class of 1944. And it, you can see this is some of the artwork was that is in that um, class book. And his artwork just tells so much about life as a cadet. I mean, I, I, I still, every time I bring these up, I study them and find something more in them that it really tells the story um, much better than I think words do. It's, there we go. And of course, like most boys, girls were on their minds. And when they were not busy training, they were talking girls or dreaming about girls. After advanced training in Pampa, Texas, Dad was sent to Pueblo, Colorado for transition training as a co-pilot on B-24 Liberators. And this is he and his crew, and he's right here. If you can see that pointer, I assume you can. Well, by this time, Germany was in a major decline, and Japan and the Pacific Theater become the focus. And the Japanese controlled a large portion of South Pacific and were dominating. They were determining to take over China, and Burma had become one of the doorways into China. They were pushing northward from Rangoon with a railroad to supply troops for their southern assault on China. So this was known as the China-Burma-India Theater, and you have Rangoon down here, and they're pushing this way to get up into China. And they were actually coming out of Thailand as well, from Thailand into Burma. And here you can see uh, the railroad that was being built north, and we also see here um, the Burma Road. And initially, the Allies in America, in the United States, were supplying China through uh, this road into China, and this actually through the southern part of the Himalayan mountains. Well, uh, that ended up getting cut off, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But in January of 1945, my father was assigned to the 493rd Bombardment Squadron, 7th Bomb Group of the 10th Air Force, which was the U.S. Army Air Force's combat command responsible for operations in the China-Burma India Theater. And the 493rd was stationed in Panaveswar, India, and that's in the northeastern part of India. It's actually way over here, uh, just north of Calcutta, northwest of Calcutta. Oops, here we go. Sorry about that. I'm hitting the wrong buttons. There we go. Um, okay, anyway, so Panaveswar, there was all over northern China, there were dispersal bases for bombers. And they were mostly kind of out in the middle of nowhere. And Panavasvar was no different. It was just a small town. It was not a city. It was a long ways from any city. Pretty much just out in the country. There wasn't much there other than the airfield. Um, from there, he flew bombing runs across the Bay of Bengal uh, into Burma, which is now known as Myanmar, and also into northern Thailand. And those missions were often 12 to 14 hours in the air. Dad's initial missions focused on the airfields and military bases between Rangoon and Bangkok. He even bombed a bridge in Thailand that some claim was the bridge that inspired the book and movie Bridge Over the River Kwai. And as I understand it, the bridge was at that time called the Bypass Bridge at Hin Pale, and the river was named the Mae Klong River at the time. And in my dad's logbooks, he talks about bombing the Bypass Bridge at Hin Pale. It was renamed the River Kwai in 1965 after the book came out. The wood bypass bridge and the concrete steel bridge were restored for the film, and they're now still there, and they're a tourist trap. He also flew missions over Rangoon, which was heavily fortified with an arsenal of anti-aircraft guns and fighter aircraft. They then switched to railroad bridges, shipping yards, and supply dumps from Rangoon to northern Burma. The mountainous terrain in northern Burma allowed only a very narrow path into China, and the railroad was a primary transport of Japanese troops and supplies. Disrupting that supply line kept the Japanese out of China. Now, Panaveswar was steamy hot in the summer and drenched in the rainy season. And the airmen there endured stifling heat, mosquitoes, snakes, wild animals, malaria, poor living conditions, inadequate supplies, and monotonous meals of spam and beans while on the ground. They take off very early in the morning, grossly overloaded, barely lifting off, and before reaching the end of the runway, and dripping in sweat in their flight suits until the sweat froze at altitude. And that was all before reaching the target, where they were often facing anti-aircraft and flak. Dad encountered very few fighter aircraft because there were not a lot of fighter aircraft actually in Burma at the time. And my father's crew was among the first trained on the Azon bomb, and that's an acronym for azimuth only. The bombardier had a joystick that he used to guide the bomb to the target. And it could only be guided right or left, not up or down. To be effective, it took low-level passes, which were what it made that aircraft an easy target for ground fire. So they were fairly dangerous missions, particularly depending on how much anti-aircraft fire there was at the bridge or protection of the bridge. Some of the bridges didn't have the anti-aircraft guns, so they weren't too bad. But those that were well protected, they were just sitting ducks, and they had to make multiple passes at the bridges. Interesting thing about the Azon bomb as well is that when they first started bombing bridges, the problem they had was that the bombs would skip, and because they were coming in low, and and if it would hit the water or hit the ground or the bank of the river or whatever, and it start skipping, and it'd skip right under the bridges and miss the bridges. And so even though they had the Azon bomb, they could direct it down at the bridge. They still had a hard time. So they ended up putting a long, I guess, kind of a spear that was about 15 foot long at the point of the bomb, so that when it was dropped, it would actually stick into the ground. And this bomb that's showing in coming out of this aircraft, of course, doesn't have that point on it, but that was what finally made them very effective. Um, while at Panaveswar, Dad noted that aircraft from other bases had nicknames and artwork painted on those. They weren't painted on the airplanes at Panaveswar. So he approached his squadron commander about painting on his aircraft. And actually, he was informed that it was not officially allowed. It was against regulations, but that the ban would not be enforced if the aircraft needed a little extra paint. And so on that, he, or their dubious comment, I guess, he He painted his first lady on the side of his airplane. And this is the sketch of that, its original sketch painted on the aircraft. And I have a number of sketches, and they're in the book that he did of the paintings that he made. Um, this one was Angry Angel. And of course, this is the aircraft that it was painted on. And then others followed suit, and soon he became a sought-after nose artist. And the majority of his paintings were, of course, scantily clad women in compromising positions. Actually, Dad said that he got out of a lot of missions uh, due to his ability to paint because the commander would allow him to paint rather than fly a mission. He still flew 44 missions, but he was quite convinced that one of those he probably would not have come back from if hadn't been able to stay home and paint this art. Many of them were based, of course, on the Milton Caniff cartoon, like this one. Uh, this this one, and he did not paint this one. This was just another one in his squadron, but it gives you an idea of the type of artwork that was used off of the Caniff illustrations. And then this is the one that my dad painted, Luscious Lace. Um, then there were the Vargas calendar girls that hung in most of the army quarters. In fact, in the day rooms, the whole wall was all the way around was framed with these pictures. And the bomber crews would come up with the name for the aircraft, and then Dad would sketch up a concept or two to go along with the name, and then the crews would choose which ones they liked. And um, this one is a cute little lass. And this is the airplane my father flew back from the States after the war. He actually said this was the nicest flying B-24 that he flew in all the time he flew over there. And I guess he said that the B-24s, even though they all came out of mostly one of two factories, he said they all flew differently. They all had personalities, and some flew very nice, and some flew just terrible. And he said this was a very nice flying airplane. But once given the go ahead, he would start very early in the morning to avoid the heat, and he'd paint until the side of the aircraft got too hot. And often he would do the initial outline and then have the crew members fill in the color. And he used whatever paint the maintenance crew could dig up, which were primarily red, white, blue, yellow, and olive drab green. And then he had a small set of oil paints that he used very sparingly to add tint to the colors, primarily the flesh tones and whatnot. And anyway, aviation fuel was used as a thinner, uh, but it would evaporate almost as soon as it touched the hot metal, which made painting very difficult. So he actually did a lot of painting as well at night, just because of that reason. He made at least 14 paintings that he could remember. And he has photos of all those 14. Those are in my book. And he also kept a collection of photos of nose art by others. I recently was contacted by Charles Kastner, whose father was a navigator in the 493rd and has written a book about his father's experiences that's soon to be published. Anyway, he sent me a photo of his father's airplane with Morse ab alto on the nose, which is a Latin for death from above. Well, my father had a photo of the same aircraft in his collection. And as it turns out, that painting also made it back to the States and is preserved in the museum along with my father's. In fact, Mr. Kastner sent me his father's travel orders to return from Tezpur, India at the end of the war that included my father's name as well. So there's a very high likelihood that they knew each other. Well, after a rather embarrassing crash of an important liberator that grounded my father's crew for a time, and you'll have to read about that in my book, um, they were transferred to the Ninth Bomb Squadron in Tezpur in the Assam Valley, located at the base of the Himalaya Mountains. And it was as close to the mountains as they could get before flying over the jungles and the mountains. And you can see here that Panaveswar was down over here. Now they've moved up to Tezpur, which actually was right around in here. Their B-24 was converted to a fuel tanker, and they haul gasoline out of India across the southern Himalayas into China. And as this shows, the Japanese had managed to push far north into Burma and cut off the Burma Road. It was the only route for the Allies to supply troops in southern China. That left only one option, and that was to fly gas and supplies over the mountain range into China in the largest and most dangerous airlift the world had ever seen. With General Stilwell commanding the ground forces and General Chennault and the AVG, better known as the Flying Tigers, defending China in concert with Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese army. They had slowed the Japanese advance, but China would be doomed to fall if supplies didn't get through from India. The flights were typically 500 miles or more over high mountains and dense jungles. Initially, the airlift was flown with the old reliable Douglas C-47 Skytrain, which was called the Dakota. And this is the airplane my Uncle Raymond flew over the Himalayas. They started flying those in 1942, and the airfields were primitive at best, and navigation aids were minimal, if non-existent. And the aircraft were overloaded and struggled to clear the mountain passes. An engine failure meant ending up on the side of a mountain or lost in a jungle maze. If one survived a crash, the elements or the wild animals or headhunters or the roving Japanese made survival pretty unlikely. My Uncle Ray, of course, was one class behind my father, and he flew over the C-47s over the hump into China. And when he left, he had the most hours of any hump pilot up to that point. And when he got home, he never flew again. He said that was it. Anyway, eventually the C-47 was replaced or joined by the Curtiss C-46 Commando, nicknamed Dumbo. Now, it could carry twice as much cargo, and it could fly at much higher altitudes. And although being a twin-engine aircraft, an engine failure often meant the same fate. As the Japanese pushed north, the airlift was forced further north as well into the higher mountains. And the C-47s and 46s were restricted to the southern routes. So they not only had to contend with the mountains and whatnot, they also now had to contend with the Japanese forces that were closer, including fighter aircraft. By the time my father was sent to Tezpur, the four-engine C-54 Skymaster had made it to the CBI, and it could fly at the higher altitudes, and it could carry significant more capacity, and it could do it more safely. Some of the worst weather in the world, again, lack of navigation aids, and the most challenging terrain in the world still took a terrible toll. And by that time, the hump, as it was a nickname, became known as the Aluminum Trail to those who flew it because of all the crashed aircraft that littered the routes. A supply of fuel was as important as ammunition to the troops in China, and shipping it aboard transport planes in barrels was inefficient at best. So, as a solution, B-24 Liberators, scheduled to be bombers at the factories, were turned into C-87 fuel tankers and sent to India. In my father's case, his B-24 was converted in the field at Tezpur and designated as C-109. The aircraft was stripped of all guns, bomb racks, and armor plating to make room for fuel tankers. And once installed, it could carry 2,900 gallons of fuel. Now, of course, it was stripped of all of its armament, so all they needed was a pilot, co-pilot, navigator, and an engineer, and that was it. There was a four-man crew at that time, and they had no protection if they did run into fighters. And the C-109 tankers earned the nickname C-10 Boom. Both the C-87s and the converted B-24s to C-109s were just flying bombs. One spark and the fuel fumes could ignite. And returning flights were particularly prone to explosion since the empty tanks were filled with fumes, as well as the fumes that leaked into the aircraft interior. So flying the hump was said to be far more dangerous than bombing runs into Burma. Not only were the Japanese fighters on the hunt a threat, the constant bad weather, dangerous terrain, lack of navigation aids, and well-worn equipment all threatened to bring the aircraft down. If they made it off the runway and didn't explode in flight, the next challenge was the weather. Brigadier General Thomas Hardin, commanding officer of the Air Transport Command, issued a no weather order, and this meant that all flights over the hump were to continue regardless of the weather, 24/7, and with the unreliable and widely spaced radio towers for navigation, much of the flying just took place in the clouds using dead reckoning with charts, a compass, and a watch, and that was it. Unpredictable winds aloft could blow aircraft off course and out of radio beacon range, and the jet stream was unknown at the time. Fierce thunderstorms were a regular occurrence, some filled with hail. Electrical storms put fear into crews because of the explosion threat. Flying blind in a storm, crews didn't know which to fear most, the clouds filled with hailstones or clouds filled with rocks. The B-24 and the C-109s could fly at altitudes over 25,000 feet, so they were sent over the highest terrain, even though some mountain peaks soared higher than that. They had to endure hours of below zero temperatures, a host of dangers, and then land fully loaded tankers on makeshift runways. Almost 700 aircraft and over 1,300 aircrew members were lost flying the hump routes. In my book, I relate not only the harrowing flights, but the day-by-day lives of those crews. My father lived to be 81 years old. He kept in contact with his crew and did a significant amount of research. He left behind large binders full of data plus hours of audio recordings relating his story. As a pilot, I've had the opportunity to fly in B-24 Liberator, and I've worked as an aircraft co-pilot mechanic on the Navy's version of the PB-4Y in my youth in civilian life. To get a sense of the hump routes, I used today's simulator technology and flew the routes my father flew. And I hope I was able to do justice to those who actually risked their lives. As I said in the beginning, Pilots and Painted Ladies is not just a history book, it's a human story that follows a young boy raised on a farm, drawn into war, and survives to return to the girl he loves. All true, it's written in the style of a novel with the hope of giving the reader a true sense of what my father and so many others experienced, both physically and mentally, in those times. I really like what one reviewer wrote. What truly elevates Pilots and Painted Ladies is the tender love story woven through the chaos of war. This is more than a war biography. It's a celebration of resilience, creativity, and love enduring under fire. So I believe I will cut it off at that point and turn it back to you, Greg.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Lawrence. That, like I said, it was really touching. A few questions. I wanted to ask you, part of the book, or a big part of it, is the courtship between your father and your mother, starting out. And I don't want to go too much into that. I'll say that for the book. But there was one interesting, as your father is overseas in the CBI, he's waiting for mail. And the mail from your mother, I guess it either stops or she held off sending, and he would. I think he got a letter from his mother, your grandmother, but he didn't get a letter from his wife for a while, and he still had to fly. And you talk about how it was difficult for him. And he had long periods of thinking over the CBI flight. I mean, could you just talk about like emotionally how when he was in the plane, he had to focus on all these negative aspects like the weather, the altitude. I know he kept repeating over and over, trust the instruments. And emotionally, what was going on at the home front, he had to just sort of block out. And if he didn't have the mail, he would just sort of psychologically hold off on that. I mean, he had a very difficult job and he couldn't let his emotions impact him. How hard was that?
Well, he wasn't alone in that. I mean, that was the loneliness of being halfway around, literally halfway around the world, and not getting mail and not knowing what was going on at home, and not knowing um, whether his wife was still there and loyal to him, and of course all kinds of things would go through his head, as far as um, what he imagined going on and whatnot, and at the same time having to focus on the flying. In a way, I think that that actually helped uh, relieve some of the tension, just be able to escape in his head, uh, because there were hours and hours of just pure boredom in the air because you got 14 hours you're flying and you only got a few minutes of sheer terror when you're over the target.
Yeah.
And so there's just a lot of time to do nothing but think. And so they spent a lot of time imagining things. So
Uh,
those letters definitely helped imagine the right things, not the wrong things.
no, absolutely. I also wanted to talk about your father. You mentioned this in the book, came from, I would say, more of a conservative. I mean, he talks about church and everything. And
Oh,
the
yeah.
impact, I think at one point in the book, you say he's worried, like, what would they think of me back home? I mean, it feels like the one significant benefit from these paintings was the camaraderie. I think, like, the all black, the all African American troop actually asked your father to put a painting on their plane, correct? I mean, it allowed him to bond with the soldiers, even though he may have had some misgivings about the paintings. I'm probably not articulating that right, but there was some tension there.
Well, I think like all young men, I mean, he was torn. I mean, he had the morality code of his very strict church that he was now halfway a world away from, and so now he's in conflict with what his emotions want to do and what
Yeah.
his teaching wanted him to do, and he had to walk that tight line,
Mm.
that tightrope line there. And I think he did it quite well. I mean, he did paint these ladies, and he felt a little guilty about painting these ladies, and that's why Mom kept all those pictures at the bottom of the chest, and I didn't see it for years because he was proud. I don't know, he was kind of torn between being proud of him and being embarrassed by him.
Yeah, no, I think at one point his commander, who originally was suspect or turned the other way, actually asked him at the end of the book to paint one of the paintings for his plane home. So it
Yes.
seemed like it was he became a bit of a celebrity. And
Yeah.
another question in the queue, and I actually wanted to ask you this too, him doing these paintings sort of gave him time off of flying. And I guess to some extent, I mean, this is a little dramatic, but would you say his skill, his art may have saved him given how dangerous those flights were?
Oh yeah, he said that. He maintained that. He said, in fact, in some of the recordings he did, he would say that yeah, he felt those paintings saved his life
Yeah.
because he would have been on missions where his buddies didn't return, and
Yeah.
he would have been on that mission if it hadn't been for painting
Yeah.
on the airplane. So, yeah, he definitely felt they saved his life.
And I wanted to ask about those missions. I mean, you talked about this in your talk here, and we talked before. Was it the altitude and the actual flight over the Himalayas, or was it the landing that was the most difficult? Because at one point, I think he says the landing was the easiest part, which surprised me.
Well, it was well, think about the Himalayas. It's got the worst weather in the world.
Yeah.
And they were flying quite often. They were flying in terrible storms in the clouds with uh, with very little instrumentation and just in constant fear of running into rocks, because they didn't know exactly where they were, and they know that there are peaks that all around them that are higher than they're flying, and they just hope that they're on course. And then, of course, they had engine fires. There was, they would be struck by lightning. There were so many things that could put them down. So, yeah, the stress, and then getting into China and having to land on these runways where there's airplanes stacked 4, 5, 6, 7 stacks high, letting down through the clouds. And yeah, I think once they actually got it on the ground, but
Yeah.
they were landing these darn tankers. They were maxed out weight wise.
Yeah, and your father kept repeating, just trust the instruments, right?
Yeah,
Ignore your emotions, trust the instruments. I
yeah.
have to say, one of the most, it probably wasn't humorous then, but at one point, I think one of his colleagues says, listen, some guys are going to get in front of you on the runway or try to jump out of the plane for like the spirit dragon or something, right? Like if I have that right, there was like some of the Chinese had a certain spiritual,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah, yeah. Actually, there were two things. One, well, they were taking the Chinese soldiers out and taking them to India for training.
yep,
But these Chinese soldiers, I mean, they came out of the fields in China. They didn't know anything about technology, and they were very superstitious. And there were cases where they would load them into the transport plane,
yeah,
and and then as the plane took off, they want to get out, so they all rushed back to the rear of the airplane, throw the center of gravity off of the airplane crashes because all these. And then the other thing was too is that if they're up over the mountains and an engine fails and they know they're going to go down and they got to lighten the load, and the only parachutes they have are for the crew, not for the Chinese. There were cases where the Chinese volunteered to just exit the airplane, and that's how they lightened the load. I mean, it was crazy. Then there was the Chinese that
it would stand
would
in front of
run
the,
out in front of the
yeah,
airplanes on takeoff because they felt that there was a spirit that was on their, right behind them, and
yeah.
if they could get close enough to the propeller, it would cut off the spirit. Well, they often didn't make it.
Yeah. No,
And so there was a standing order. You don't stop your takeoff run if you hit a Chinese. You just keep on going.
yeah,
And that was an actual order.
that is crazy.
Yeah.
Um, the last thing about, I think you say 18,000, 19,000 planes were destroyed, or let me ask two specific questions. How many planes did your father paint, and how much of his artwork and the others' artwork made it back home? It felt like most of the planes were destroyed or
Well, yeah, yeah. Almost all the planes. Well, we don't know how many got back to the States. There were 19,000 B-24s, but the number that came back we don't know. And then of course they all went to salvage yards and were all chopped up. And we only know of these 34 paintings that were saved out of all of those that came back. And my dad, as far as he knows, he painted 14 paintings, maybe more.
yeah,
And two of those, probably three of those got back. And two of them were saved in museum, and the other one, we don't know what happened to it.
got it. There's you briefly talk about in the book when they announced the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I guess they pretty much said the war was over, or discontinued the flights at that point. Did your father talk about the mood then at all? In the book, they seem pretty obviously happy because I think it means the end of the war and their return home.
Yeah, well, I know initially they were worried that they were going to have to stay and do the cleanup and whatnot. So the day that he got his orders to return, of course, they were elated. And then, of course, in the book too, it talks about his trip back. They flew a B-24 back, and
Yeah.
the mood in that B-24 was completely different than any other moods going the other direction.
No, I think you talk about how I think they landed South America, and you're like, hey, it's America, like
Yeah,
we're back
yeah,
home
it's
on the continent.
yeah,
And I think they routed through Palm Beach or Miami too, so I can't even
yeah,
imagine.
yeah. He left the plane in Miami. Oh,
Yeah.
and
How,
this right here,
yeah. Oh,
this is the 8 hour, the 8 day clock out of his B-24 that he flew back.
it's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, you end the book, I think, on a very poignant note. I sees his parents in the crowd, and I think your mother says, "Go to your wife" and everything. So it is a touching, I guess, love story as well in the book. Um, I wanted to briefly, you didn't talk so much about this in this talk, but in the book too, your father had artistic skills. I mean, I think even in college he was doing drawings and doodles as well,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
He didn't, this just didn't creep up overnight. I mean, and even at one point, I think he almost talked about art and the human body and anatomy as being a real skill, a real gift. I mean, can you maybe talk briefly about his view of art, and when he returned home, he became a very well-known architect as well.
Yeah, he became an architect, and he then when he retired, he took up painting again. In fact, on my website there is paintings there. By the way, I did want to show you this too. Oh, wait a minute, I just blew it here. Excuse me. Uh, um, uh, I got to go all the way down to get all the way through these things, but I have on my website at drakeip.com.
Yeah.
I have a bunch of his artwork. Uh, let's see, where is it here? Yeah, drakeip.com. I've got a bunch of his later life artwork, his um, watercolors. But he said that architecture ruined his artistic ability
Oh, okay.
because he had to be so precise,
Yeah.
and he had to learn all over again how to loosen up
Hmm.
and to paint again. But he did paint again. And then I also want to point out that on my website, I do have a link to a 12-minute video
Hmm.
that actually it was initially a 30-minute video based on his time there. And it's a documentary, and it's got a lot of footage um, from Panaveswar and from the CBI because on Panaveswar, the Ninth Photo Reconnaissance Squadron was based there, and their job, of course, was to take pictures of the war, and so there are some reels there, some video footage of Panavaswar and of CBI.
Oh,
So
very,
that's at drakeip.com.
very nice. Um, yeah, and I guess it feels like what I was trying to ask you is like, I feel like he had the artistic skill, prior to the war and even after the war, he pursued it. But did he talk about art as being, I mean, these weren't just comics, but I think he felt like these were works of art, or there was an artistic skill behind his process.
Well, when he was in the service,
Yeah.
he didn't refer to himself as an artist. He
Uh,
said, "I'm a cartoonist."
okay.
That's what he billed himself as a cartoonist, not an artist. And
Oh.
he kind of maintained that up until he started painting again later in life. Yeah.
And what were his later paintings?
His later paintings are really a lot of Western
Hmm.
scenes. They're really good. If you get a chance, take a look at them. Uh, there's some really fine art there.
Um, Definitely we'll do that. Last question. It seems like most of the inspiration for his paintings for the planes were pinup calendars. Is that right?
Yeah,
I mean, as
yeah,
opposed to the girlfriends or wives.
yeah, yeah. And
Mm.
it generally, like as I said, the crews would come to him with an idea of what they wanted, and then he would try to come up with something to fit their bill.
Totally. And last question, could you talk about how they came up with the name? I felt that was interesting. It was like a group discussion, and your father sometimes would change the name or change like maid to maid, that type of thing. MAID versus MED. Could you talk about
Yeah, usually the names had something to do with the airplane, or it was named after a spouse or a girlfriend or something like that. But just um, uh, the the crew generally had already nicknamed the airplane often, and then he would come up with the image to go along with the nickname. But it was a crew's decision, and um, so he would just try to turn their ideas into art, and
that?
generally he did a good job of that.
Absolutely. I think that's all the questions we have in the queue. Thank you very much, Lawrence. That was a great talk. Fascinating. Again, the book is Pilots and Painted Ladies, 493rd Bomb Squadron, and the Airborne, the CBI. And we really only touched on some of the key themes, but like I said, it's a very poignant book. Please join us next Tuesday, well, I'm sorry, next Saturday, when historian Bill Ibel will discuss Into the Inferno, the story of a B-17 gunner over Nazi-occupied Europe, which also has a lot of hair-raising moments similar to the talk today. Lawrence, thanks again for your time, and we hope to have you back. And thanks for our audience for joining us today.
Well, I sure appreciate you inviting me, and I'm glad I was able to participate.
No, it was wonderful. Thanks, Lawrence. Take care, everyone.